So tonight I want to talk to you about the real Secretary of State, not this guy. No, I mean the real Secretary of State, this guy. Now, if you don't recognize this guy, that's Steve Witkoff, and you may not have heard of him before this week when he kind of burst into the news with Signalgate. He was one of the people on that now infamous Signal chat, and what made him remarkable was he was in Russia at the time of the Signal chat. Now, he tells us he did not have his personal device with him, and the personal device is where he had this classified chat going on his device. Now, of course, that begs the question, where the hell was his phone if it wasn't on him, and who else had access to that phone? But setting that aside, I want to talk to you about why Steve Witkoff is probably the most important player in the Trump administration when it comes to the foreign policy of the United States. And I want to tell you about the ham and cheese sandwich that was heard around the world. So, who is this guy? Well, Steve Witkoff, it probably won't surprise you to know, is very rich. He is a New York real estate developer. That is the beginning of his association, of course, with Donald Trump. He first met Trump long ago when he was a real estate lawyer and participated in some transaction involving Donald Trump. But it wasn't until 8 years later when he ran into Donald Trump in a deli in New York, and Trump was out of money, and he basically bummed a ham and cheese sandwich off of Steve Witkoff. Witkoff bought him a ham and cheese sandwich. Well, apparently that was a real bonding experience. So if you want to get on the president's good side, buy him a ham and cheese sandwich. Anyway, after that, they started playing golf together. And you might ask, what better qualification could you have to be an envoy to the Middle East and Russia than a ham and cheese sandwich, real estate development, and golf? But those are pretty solid criteria in Trump world. So he is made envoy to the Middle East and envoy to Russia. Now, he is credited by the president for helping in the Middle East arrange a temporary truce and the release of hostages. But his real impact is actually his Russia portfolio. This is where he will have and is having a seminal and destructive impact on the foreign policy of the United States. Now, he goes to Russia as this envoy, and let's just talk about his report back from Russia. Well, it was a little bit like this. That's right, nothing but love coming back from his visit to the Kremlin and his visits with Vladimir Putin. During a recent interview with Tucker Carlson, Steve Witkoff had this to say about the Kremlin dictator. He described him as, well, a good guy, someone that he believed was a man of his word. Here's what he had to say about that.
I don't regard Putin as a bad guy. That is a complicated situation, that war, and all the ingredients that led up to it. And it's never just one person, right?
So he is already vouching for the Kremlin dictator, but not content with vouching for the credibility, the character of the Kremlin dictator. He's got some heartwarming stories to tell us about the Kremlin dictator. For example, he talks about how Putin went to church to pray for our president, not as a former president at the time, but as a friend. Here he is.
And told me a story, Tucker, about how when the president was shot, he went to his local church and met with his priest and prayed for the president, not because he was the president of he could become the president of the United States, but because he had a friendship with him and he was praying for his friend. It was, can you imagine sitting there and listening to these kind of conversations?
That's right. This godless communist, we're to believe, was praying for our president, and not as a way of phony ingratiation with the president, but because of his, I'm sure, devoted belief to the Almighty and great fondness for his friend, the Donald Trump. But he goes on from there and recounts another heartwarming story about the former KGB operative known as Vladimir Putin. This one involves a painting, and how Vladimir Putin, out of the goodness of his heart and having no ulterior motive, commissioned a painting of Donald Trump for Donald Trump. Here's Mr. Witkoff.
The President Putin had commissioned a beautiful portrait of President Trump from the leading Russian artist, and actually gave it to me and asked me to take it home to President Trump, which I brought home and delivered to him. It's been reported in the paper, but it was such a gracious moment.
All I can say is, I hope that our intelligence community did a thorough examination of that painting. But be that as may, it just demonstrates, doesn't it, the good character of the Kremlin dictator. When he's not murdering children and kidnapping them from Ukraine and bombing civilians, he's having portraits done out of the goodness of his heart. But those weren't the most destructive things that Witkoff has had to say about Putin and Russia. What he's really done is carry the most awful, false Kremlin talking points, carry the dirtiest of water for the Kremlin. For example, here he is talking about how the Ukraine war started and which party was really responsible.
That the war didn't need to happen. It was provoked. It doesn't necessarily mean it was provoked by the Russians. There were all kinds of conversations back then about Ukraine joining NATO. The president has spoken about this. That didn't need to happen. It basically became a threat to the Russians, and so we have to deal with that fact.
That's right. In his view, this was egged on by Ukraine. Ukraine, the victim, was somehow responsible for its own invasion by Russia. But here he is again, now this time justifying, rationalizing the invasion and forced occupation of Ukrainian lands by Russian troops. Here he is saying that, well, they're Russian speaking, and what's more, they have voted to be annexed to Russia. Here he is.
They're Russian speaking.
Yep.
There have been referendums where the overwhelming majority of the people have indicated that they want to be under Russian rule.
Yes.
I think that's the key issue in the conflict. So that's the first thing.
All right, let's do a fact check on this horrendous Kremlin propaganda that he is now spouting. So let's talk about those referenda. So the Russians invade Ukrainian lands. They force the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. They militarily occupy Ukraine. They have these sham referenda in which obviously the Ukrainians who've been forced to flee their homes don't have a chance to vote. And what's more, they kidnap and torture Ukrainian opposition that's from these regions of Ukraine. They have soldiers going to polling stations and supposedly carrying ballot boxes. They have a sham referenda that no one outside of Russia, no one believes is credible except Steve Witkoff. The Russians have an expression, I'm sure you've heard it. They call people useful idiots, someone who is an idiot but is useful to them. Well, when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, there is no more useful idiot apparently than Steve Witkoff. But here's what J.D. Vance had to say about Steve Witkoff. That's right, turns out a lot of good diplomacy comes down to the proposition, don't be an idiot. Well, you know, I would say that's true. The problem is, apparently, that's exactly what we have in Mr. Witkoff. Someone who believes that Putin is a man of his word. He literally described Putin as a man of his word, essentially told Ukrainians, told our allies in the Baltic states, told our allies in NATO, don't be worried about Russian aggression or territorial ambition. Putin is a man of his word. How foolish do you have to be to believe that? And how destructive on the eve of negotiations, forced negotiations by this administration between Ukraine and Russia, on the eve and during these negotiations, how idiotic, how harmful to have our chief interlocutor essentially parroting Russian talking points about the origin of the war, about who's responsible, about bogus referenda, about whether these lands are truly Ukrainian or whether they're really Russian because there are Russian speakers there. Can you imagine going into a negotiation where you're supposedly, well, frankly, you should be the advocate of the democratically elected, invaded country not the aggressor. But even if you were going to make some pretense to neutrality, cutting off military support of Ukraine, cutting off intelligence support of Ukraine, parroting Russian talking points, that is not being a neutral arbiter. That is being a Kremlin puppet. And that's what Witkoff has been. So you may not have heard of him or been tracking him until the whole Signalgate controversy, but he has been singularly destructive of our relationship with our European allies, with our Ukrainian ally, and with the hopes of freedom-loving people all over the world. Hey everybody, so I started to make these nightly videos because I kept hearing from people with everything going on, it'd be nice to have some explanation at the end of the day that helps make sense of it all. So that's what I've tried to do, but I would love your feedback, and if you'd like to continue the conversation, please join along. But let me know, are there subjects you want me to cover? Are there movie clips you want me to include? As you can tell, I'm a movie fan, but I hope we'll get to continue the conversation and welcome your feedback.